Okay, thank you for doing this, Jim.
Well,
My first question for you is, have the markets behaved in the way that you'd expect them to during this crisis?
oh gosh, have the markets behaved the way I thought? I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago that actually is getting quite a lot of circulation, that how the markets behave during this crisis simply confirms to me that they remain both mesmerizing and bewildering as always. We've seen that in a space of a couple of weeks, the most severe bear market, I think, ever. And then since the last week of March, we've seen something close to a 30-odd% rally. And so you've had both. And here we are, at least looking at the US market, about 10% off the all-time highs, despite the fact we're looking at, it's certainly probably the worst economic decline of my life. So you tell me, is that how one might have expected it? Is that rational? I don't know, but I think it's fascinating. I personally am not as dismissive of the market's recovery as I observe and listen to virtually every other person I know. Partly because I learned a long time ago to, whilst you always have to question the markets, I've learned, I think, more than many other traditional economists, it's actually dangerous to be dismissive of them just because it doesn't suit your view. And it might well be that the markets know more about what is still yet to happen than many of us that comment on them. And obviously, if it turns out that we do get a vaccine found very quickly, and it's got staggering efforts to get it produced quickly, then the market's optimism could turn out to be right. After all, back in January, when this thing first started to appear, it was rampant consensus view of a V-shaped recovery, both for the equity markets and the economies, because that's how it was in SARS and MERS. And it's very interesting to me now that people think that idea is essentially ludicrous. And I'm not sure that it is, even though obviously I would quickly add, I can think of at least 30 reasons why it won't happen, but let's see.
And so far, do you think governments and multilateral organizations like the IMF have been making the right noises and doing the right things? And what can they be doing more of, perhaps?
So I've got mixed opinions. I think on the multilateral front, here I would side with the bears. I think if you contrast this with 2008, and it's impossible to go any further without immediately focusing on US leadership. The G20 essentially was brought into, not existence because it was set up in the late 90s, but it was brought into real life by George Bush in 2007 and followed up by Gordon Brown, the famous UK chairing of the G20 in 2008. And that allowed all the multinational organizations that were necessary to resolve that crisis, of which the IMF was at the center, to do their thing. Unfortunately, because of Trump's, from what I can see, lack of interest and maybe his lack of capability, that is simply not happening, intermingled with the fact that he sees this strange political benefit of blaming everything on the rest of the world, particularly China. And all of that is very unhelpful, and there's been a big hindrance to certain aspects of getting out of this crisis. And that's disappointing. However, possibly despite that, or maybe now as I'm saying it, possibly because of it, we see incredible policy response of a scale that's way bigger than 2008, including in the States. Fiscal response is enormous in the US, and all sorts of things from central banks that they would never dream of doing. I would have done things somewhat differently. Thinking here in the UK, I wrote a piece and talked about it in the House of Lords and got a lot of attention on it in the Lords, even just after the budget, for what I would call people's QE. And I think the idea of just having a loan-based approach to helping business is not the right way to do it, as we see a lot of problems with. And I think they should have been, and perhaps still needs to be a bit more imaginative and think of different ideas, possibly involving equity investment or gifting or grants. Excuse me.
No,
I hope that's not what you know what.
People always look to you to sort of think about what regions to invest in. So with that in mind, as you kind of look to see us and us recover from this global crisis, what economies and regions would you be looking at the moment?
I mean, that's a tough call, and tougher in a way than usual, because of course this is hitting the whole world at the same time. That said, I'd have two comments, or two big comments. Firstly, if I go back to my days at Goldman, I presided in the noughties when I started the BRICS thing off over the development of something called the Goldman Sachs Global Sustainability Economic Indicator for about 180 countries. And I think they stopped producing it in 2014. That's the last one. But if you look at the top 10 scoring countries on that index, interestingly, about 8 of those 10 so far, and we're talking at the end of the first week of May, have been the ones that seem to have dealt with this crisis better than everybody else. So that's a very high correlation. And it doesn't really surprise me. And so it includes quite a few obvious places in Asia, notably South Korea, and the Scandinavian countries, Germany, New Zealand and Australia. So in that sense, and that's allowing all of them both to not have such an extended shutdown as other places, and probably emerge more with less questions about the long-term structure of their societies than in many other places, including the UK, the US, continental Europe, and so on. And so a sort of basket of those places might be interesting. The second thing I would say is we came into this crisis because of the past decade and China's own problems with emerging market equities being reasonably well valued compared to the US and elsewhere. And notwithstanding the considerable challenges that emerging markets may have in the near term, I think if you close your eyes and invested and didn't look at them for 3 or 4 years, I think if you were going to invest in equities, they would be a better place to put money than elsewhere right now.
Cool. Wow, that's a big shout and interesting way of looking at it. Turning to your kind of knowledge of public health and sort of broader knowledge of vaccines and AMR. How do you think this pandemic is going to reshape our attitude to public health, and what changes do you think we should be seeing across the board, perhaps thinking more broadly than just the dealing with the pandemic in front of us at the moment?
Yeah. So yeah, I've got some big views about this. I'll say perhaps 4 things. First of all, as evidenced by what I learned as a finance person with a wonderful privilege of leading that review into AMR, there is no rational distinction between investment in health and finance. And of course, this crisis has made that rather clear. And part of the challenge of my AMR review was, and the consequences afterwards still have been, trying to persuade people in the world of finance to treat these things seriously. And so I think that message and lesson has been learned rather spectacularly. Second thing in that regard, in the past couple of years, I was increasingly trying to be noisy about, linked to my first point, that the IMF, as part of what's called their annual Article 4 series, where they write a review of all their member countries, should be mandated or choose to start talking about system or countries' health investments and preparedness for health shocks. And the IMF graciously invited me to go there and talk about it, but about a year and a half ago, and ended up saying they didn't have the resources and it wasn't their area of expertise. But I think now they're going to have to.
Yeah.
Because as we've seen, for all the efforts that they and everybody else around the world makes about climate change, this is just as important, possibly more. And it is not going to be the last pandemic we have. Third thing I would say in that regard, whether the IMF does it or not, and linked to the second and first point, I would imagine trying to figure out in various countries that have struggled with it, what has been wrong with their health systems is going to be a major policy priority. And looking at why the likes of Germany, in particular in the developed world, seemingly has coped so well. And interestingly, as it relates to the emerging world, why certain African countries so far, I hope I don't regret this in a few weeks, but the likes of South Africa are so far coping way better than people would have thought. Is it because of them having to deal with TB and HIV and all the rest of it? And I think it will force many other countries to think more seriously about investment spending in health in the same way they might think about investing in a train system or a bus. And then the fourth thing, lastly, specifically on antimicrobial resistance, I really hope it doesn't get lost as a cousin because of all the attention on COVID-19. And God forbid that it does, because of course, one of the consequences of COVID-19 is that because of the pneumonia and all the other strange consequences, antibiotics are also almost definitely being used so much more than they would have been, which by definition means that the rate of resistance will accelerate. So I'm spending quite a bit of time trying to encourage health leaders around the world to make sure they follow through on some of our recommendations and don't allow it to get lost as part of this crisis.
Yeah. And you touched on public health, obviously being a positive, there can be positive things coming out of this on that angle. Are there finally, are there kind of any other positive things that you can see emerging from this, terrible global situation?
Here I'm going to contradict you a little bit, or contradict myself.
Yeah.
Actually, should I say that? So, firstly, because of my experience of going through crises, I'm a little bit wary of trying to make too many bold predictions about what permanent changes there are going to be as a result of this crisis. It's just so easy and frankly quite superficial to do that, not least because it's interesting, and it is. And I'll give you one example. It's not at all clear to me that this popular notion that globalization is now definitely finished. I think that's probably unlikely. And I cite the dramatic cooperation going on between pharmaceutical companies and universities all over the world to find vaccines and treatments, which I wouldn't have dreamt of being possible 6 months ago. And as I sort of jokingly said to a US TV station 2 days ago, are you trying to tell me in this sort of America first that if somebody in the rest of the world develops a vaccine, the US isn't going to want to get access to it? I don't believe it's true. So I'm skeptical about those kind of things.
Yeah.
Some parts of it might be true. And here's the contradictory part. I do think it will make people a bit more wary about the scale at which they've done things. So the scale of dependency on China as a sort of so in the supply chain, I think will make people think. I don't think it means the end of China's role, but I think the scale in which big multinationals have used China will definitely change. And I think it will make people think a little bit more carefully about the quality of a big, long distance trip they're going to make. Why don't they just do what you and I are doing here? But I do think, that said, and again, another contradiction, once we get a vaccine, I would imagine the travel business is going to go through the roof. And once my own confidence about vaccine development, some of which I know quite well, goes up, I might be trying to buy a few shares in some of them myself. The other thing I would say, and the big, and here another contradiction about the tone of what I've said, notwithstanding that we have to be careful about what we see as permanent changes through a crisis. After all, for me personally, 9/11 and the remarkable crisis and tragedy that came with that, and the downing of the Twin Towers and all the rest of that atrocity, is what caused me to dream up the BRIC acronym. So I do think instincts that one may have, and ones that I certainly think that for this myself, if I have a strong hunch, there are things that I don't like to tell myself, don't be so silly. And I suspect in that regard, this sort of nascent growth in what I would call a world of the stakeholder business, as opposed to the obsession with profit maximization, is probably going to accelerate. And I caution myself in saying that, and caution you or your audience in listening to it, that I hope I'm not confusing what I would like to happen with what I'm saying will. But I think particularly when you think of the generational issues and younger people who've lost out so badly through all of this, it is something which is going to be demanded more by society, and a big healthy challenge, particularly for the Anglo-Saxon world. And I suspect that that's something that will emerge.
Cool. Well, thank you. Definitely some food for thought to consider with.